The old masters knew things about the world we have forgotten. They understood the currents of life, the quiet whispers of the soul, and the deceptive nature of a man's own heart. They wrote down their wisdom not in grand pronouncements but in quiet truths. These are the truths a man often stumbles upon only when his hair has turned to silver and his steps have slowed. He finds them in the ruins of his ambition, in the echoes of his regrets, and in the silence of his lonely nights. He realizes the battles he fought were with himself. He learns the walls he built were his own prison. He sees the treasures he chased were made of dust. This is the wisdom that arrives like a winter sun, beautiful but too late to warm the bones. Listen closely before the sun sets on your own day. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The tallest tree began as a tiny seed. Patience is a bitter plant, but its fruit is sweet. Do not wish for an easy life. Wish for the strength to endure a difficult one. The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. Time is a created thing. To say I don't have time is like saying I don't want to. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. A moment of patience can ward off a great disaster. A moment of impatience can ruin a whole life. He who is contented is rich. The wise man desires to be slow in his speech and earnest in his conduct. Silence is a source of great strength. He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. To know that you do not know is the beginning of wisdom. An angry man is full of poison. The greatest warrior is one who conquers himself. If you are patient in one moment of anger, you will escape 100 days of sorrow. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. The man who asks a question is a fool for a minute. The man who does not ask is a fool for life. A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials. The wise find pleasure in water. The virtuous find pleasure in hills. Everything has beauty, but not everyone sees it. The person who says it cannot be done should not interrupt the person who is doing it. A superior man is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions. To see what is right and not do it is a lack of courage. Respect yourself and others will respect you. A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. The flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long. Be like water which is soft and yielding, but can overcome the hardest things. Mastering others is strength. Mastering yourself is true power. When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everybody will respect you. The wise man does not lay up his own treasures. The more he gives to others, the more he has for his own. To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom. If you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. The best fighter is never angry. Care about what other people think and you will always be their prisoner. Simplicity, patience, compassion. These three are your greatest treasures. From labor comes rest. He who is satisfied with his lot is rich. The words of truth are always paradoxical. A good traveler has no fixed plans and is not intent on arriving. When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be. Respond intelligently even to unintelligent treatment. The ruler who governs through his virtue is like the pole star, which remains in its place while all the other stars revolve around it. It is easy to hate, and it is difficult to love. This is how the whole scheme of things works. All good things are difficult to achieve, and bad things are very easy to get. He who learns but does not think is lost. He who thinks but does not learn is in great danger. The more you know, the more you know you don't know. Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. If you think in terms of a year, plant a seed. If in terms of 10 years, plant tree. If in terms of 100 years, teach the people. Wheresoever you go, go with all your heart. The man who says he can and the man who says he can't are both correct. Choose a job you love and you will never have to work a day in your life. Our greatest glory is not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. When it is obvious that the goals cannot be reached, don't adjust the goals, adjust the action steps. If you look into your own heart and you find nothing wrong there, what is there to worry about? What is there to fear? The superior man thinks always of virtue, the common man thinks of comfort. Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. Men's natures are alike. It is their habits that carry them far apart. The will to win, the desire to succeed, the urge to reach your full potential. These are the keys that will unlock the door to personal excellence. To be wronged is nothing unless you continue to remember it. He who speaks without modesty will find it difficult to make his words good. It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop. The superior man is distressed by the limitations of his ability. He is not distressed by the fact that men do not recognize the ability that he has. Consider the past and you shall know the future. Death and life have their determined appointments. Riches and honors depend upon heaven. Study the past if you would define the future. They must often change who would be constant in happiness or wisdom. Learning without thought is labor lost. Thought without learning is perilous. The man of virtue makes the difficulty to be overcome his first business, and success only a subsequent consideration. The superior man acts before he speaks and afterwards speaks according to his actions. What the superior man seeks is in himself. What the small man seeks is in others. In a country well governed, poverty is something to be ashamed of. In a country badly governed, wealth is something to be ashamed of. To practice 5 things under all circumstances constitutes perfect virtue. These 5 are gravity, generosity of soul, sincerity, earnestness, and kindness. Without feelings of respect, what is there to distinguish men from beasts? Fine words and an insinuating appearance are seldom associated with true virtue. The cautious seldom err. The superior man understands what is right. The inferior man understands what will sell. Only the wisest and stupidest of men never change. We have two lives, and the second begins when we realize we only have one. The essence of knowledge is having it to apply it, not having it to confess your ignorance. A fool despises his own build, a wise man makes the most of his. He who aims to be a man of complete virtue in his food does not seek to gratify his appetite. The superior man in the world does not set his mind either for anything or against anything. What is right he will follow. A man without persistence will never make a good shaman or a good physician. Virtue is not left to stand alone. He who practices it will have neighbors. Hold faithfulness and sincerity as first principles. He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it. To go beyond is as wrong as to fall short. To be wealthy and honored in an unjust society is a disgrace. Have no friends not equal to yourself. When you see a good person, think of becoming like them. When you see someone not so good, reflect on your own weak points. He who wishes to secure the good of others has already secured his own. The noble-minded are calm and steady. Little people are fussing and fretting. A lion chased me up a tree, and I greatly enjoyed the view from the top. The true gentleman is not recognized by his station, but by his heart. He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough. If you want happiness for an hour, take a nap. If you want happiness for a day, go fishing. If you want happiness for a year, inherit a fortune. If you want happiness for a lifetime, help somebody. The man who is master of himself is greater than he who is master of a city. Better a diamond with a flaw than a pebble without. Do not be afraid of growing slowly. Be afraid only of standing still. When anger rises, think of the consequences. If you want your children to have a peaceful life, let them suffer a little hunger and a little cold. A closed mind is like a closed book, just a block of wood. The person who is always smiling is the strongest. A bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. Keep a green tree in your heart, and perhaps the singing bird will come. He who cheats the earth will be cheated by the earth. A single conversation with a wise man is better than 10 years of study. If you are planning for a year, sow rice. If you are planning for a decade, plant trees. If you are planning for a lifetime, educate people. A nation's treasure is in its scholars. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. To know the road ahead, ask those coming back. Experience is a comb which nature gives us when we are bald, all things in moderation. The more laws and order are made prominent, the more thieves and robbers there will be. Do the difficult things while they are easy, and do the great things while they are small. The mark of a successful man is one that has spent an entire day on the bank of a river without feeling guilty about it. He who talks more is sooner exhausted. Flow with whatever may happen and let your mind be free. Stay centered by accepting whatever you are doing. This is the ultimate. The snow goose need not bathe to make itself white. Neither need you do anything but be yourself. There is no greater calamity than indulging in discontent. Be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. The truth is not always beautiful, nor beautiful words the truth. Life is a series of natural and spontaneous changes. Don't resist them. That only creates sorrow. Let reality be reality. Let things flow naturally forward in whatever way they like. If the student is not better than the teacher, then the teacher is a failure. A man with outward courage dares to die. A man with inner courage dares to live. Because of a great love, one is courageous. If you would take, you must first give. This is the beginning of intelligence. The power of intuitive understanding will protect you from harm until the end of your days. He who is contented is rich. The wise man is one who knows what he does not know. To a mind that is still, the entire universe surrenders. Treat those who are good with goodness, and also treat those who are not good with goodness. Thus goodness is attained. Be honest to those who are honest, and be also honest to those who are not honest. Thus honesty is attained. The softest things in the world overcome the hardest things in the world. Empty yourself of everything. Let the mind become still. He who defines himself can't know who he really is. He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow. The reason why the universe is eternal is that it does not live for itself. It gives life to others as it transforms. Give evil nothing to oppose, and it will disappear by itself. Water is the softest thing, yet it can penetrate mountains and earth. This shows clearly the principle of softness overcoming hardness. Stop thinking and end your problems. He who controls others may be powerful, but he who has mastered himself is mightier still. The past has no power over the present moment. The usefulness of a pot comes from its emptiness. Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. An ant on the move does more than a dozing ox. If you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you are living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present. That which is brittle is easy to break. That which is smooth is easy to scatter. A clever builder leaves no trace. Fame or integrity, which is more important? Money or happiness, which is more valuable? Success or failure, which is more destructive? He who is attached to things will suffer much. He who saves will suffer heavy loss. A contented man is never disappointed. He who knows when to stop does not find himself in trouble. He will stay forever safe. Success is as dangerous as failure. Hope is as hollow as fear. What is success? Fearing failure is to be successful. What is failure? Having succeeded is to fail. The master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. A leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, "We did it ourselves." The world is a sacred vessel. It should not be meddled with. He who meddles with it will spoil it. He who holds it will lose it. To know that you do not know is the best. To pretend to know when you do not know is a disease. The people are hungry because the government eats too much tax grain. The people are difficult to rule because the government is too intrusive. The people are not afraid of death because they are too eager to live. The difficult problems in life always start off being simple. Great things in life always start off being small. The wise man does not contend, therefore no one can contend with him. The heavy is the root of the light. The still is the master of the restless. He who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened. He who conquers others has physical strength. He who conquers himself is strong. He who is satisfied with his lot is rich. He who acts with vigor has a will. He who does not lose his place will endure. He who dies and is not forgotten has longevity. All streams flow to the sea because it is lower than they are. Humility gives it its power. To be great, one must be humble. To lead, one must serve. The wise man puts himself last and finds himself first. He is detached from all things, therefore he is one with them. Because he has no selfish desires, he is able to fulfill his own desires. The best of men is like water. Water benefits all things and does not compete with them. It dwells in places that all disdain, which is why it is so near to the Tao. In dwelling, be close to the land. In meditation, go deep in the heart. In dealing with others, be gentle and kind. In speech, be true. In ruling, be just. In business, be competent. In action, watch the timing. No fight, no blame. Fill your bowl to the brim and it will spill. Keep sharpening your knife and it will blunt. Chase after money and security and your heart will never unclench. Care about people's approval and you will be their prisoner. Do your work, then step back. The only path to serenity. The wise person has no need for his own traveler's checks, for he has already arrived at his destination. There is no crime greater than having too many desires. There is no disaster greater than not being content. There is no misfortune greater than being covetous. He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough. He who stands on tiptoe is not steady. He who strides cannot maintain the pace. He who displays himself does not shine. He who asserts his own views is not distinguished. He who boasts of his own abilities has no merit. He who praises himself will not endure. He who is self-righteous is not respected. These are excesses of food and waste of deeds. These are things that all creatures despise. Therefore, he who has the Tao does not abide in them. Those who know do not talk. Those who talk do not know. Keep your mouth shut. Guard your senses, temper your sharpness, simplify your problems, mask your brightness, be at one with the dust of the earth. This is primal union. He who has achieved this state is unconcerned with friends and enemies, with good and harm, with honor and disgrace. This, therefore, is the highest state of man. When a country is in harmony with the Tao, the factories make trucks and tractors. When a country goes counter to the Tao, warheads are stockpiled outside the cities. There is no greater illusion than fear, no greater wrong than preparing to defend yourself. No greater misfortune than having an enemy. Whoever can see through all fear will always be safe. A man is born gentle and weak. At his death he is hard and stiff. Green plants are tender and filled with sap. At their death they are withered and dry. Therefore the stiff and unbending is the disciple of death. The gentle and yielding is the disciple of life. Thus, an army without flexibility never wins a battle. A tree that is unbending is easily broken. The hard and strong will fall. The soft and weak will overcome. Act without expectation. When you lose your desire for things that do not matter, you will be free. Let it be. Be still like a mountain and flow like a great river. If a man can be detached from the things that are not essential to his happiness, he will be happy. The one who is truly wise is the one who knows he knows nothing. Life is the child of death. Do not seek to follow in the footsteps of the men of old. Seek what they sought. The reverse side also has a reverse side. The day you decide to do it is your lucky day. When you have completed 95% of your journey, you are only halfway there. If you make a mistake and do not correct it, this is called a mistake. Flowing water never goes stale, so you have to keep moving. The tongue is like a sharp knife. It kills without drawing blood. We're born alone. We live alone. We die alone. Only through our love and friendship can we create the illusion for the moment that we're not alone. If you don't want anyone to know, don't do it. A little impatience will spoil great plans. A clear conscience is never afraid of a knock in the middle of the night. Distant water won't quench a nearby fire. He who asks is a fool for 5 minutes, but he who does not ask remains a fool forever. Better to be without a book than to believe a book entirely. A fall into a ditch makes you wiser. A smile will gain you 10 more years of life. One cannot refuse to eat just because there is a chance of being choked. He who is narrow of vision is broad of claim. When the winds of change blow, some people build walls and others build windmills. Enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. Be not afraid of going slowly. Be afraid only of standing still. It is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. The best government is one that governs least. The wise man does not wear silk in his own village. A wise man makes his own decisions. An ignorant man follows public opinion. To be uncertain is to be uncomfortable, but to be certain is to be ridiculous. The man who strikes first admits that his ideas have given out. He who sacrifices his conscience to ambition burns a picture to obtain the ashes. Do not believe what you hear. Believe what you see. A single spark can start a prairie fire. Do not be too sweet lest you be eaten up. Do not be too bitter lest you be spewed out. One dog barks at something, the rest bark at him. One joy scatters 100 griefs. The poor man is not he who has little, but he who desires much. 1,000 cups of wine do not suffice when drinking with a bosom friend. The more you sweat in practice, the less you bleed in battle. If your strength is small, don't carry heavy burdens. If your words are worthless, don't give advice. If you want to know your past, look into your present conditions. If you want to know your future, look into your present actions. Dig the well before you are thirsty. Man's schemes are inferior to the schemes of heaven. To forget one's ancestors is to be a brook without a source, a tree without a root. A book is like a garden carried in the pocket. Talk does not cook rice. You can't expect the harvest in the spring. He who thinks too much about every step he takes will always stay on one leg. A thorn defends the rose, harming only those who would steal the blossom. Man's life is limited, but knowledge is limitless. To be totally at leisure for one day is to be immortal for one day. Patience is the knot which secures the seam of victory. Govern a family as you would cook a small fish, very gently. Better to do good in your own house than to go to a distant temple to burn incense. A wise man adapts himself to circumstances, as water shapes itself to the vessel that contains it. The loftiest towers rise from the ground. He who has seen the world does not puzzle at a molehill. One who seeks revenge should remember to dig 2 graves. A man who cannot tolerate small misfortunes can never accomplish great things. A bit of fragrance clings to the hand that gives flowers. If you bow at all, bow low. He who is drowned is not troubled by the rain. If you suspect a man, don't employ him, and if you employ him, don't suspect him. Learning is a weightless treasure you can always carry easily. If you must play, decide on 3 things at the start: the rules of the game, the stakes, and the quitting time. Of all the 36 alternatives, running away is best. The person who has come to steal your horse is not going to shut the gate. A clear stream does not dread a muddy entrance. To have a stomach full of reasoning and a mouth full of courtesy is a sign of wisdom. With true friends, even water drunk together is sweet enough. If I am walking with 2 other men, each of them will serve as my teacher. I will pick out the good points of the one and imitate them, and the bad points of the other and correct them in myself. The trees that are slow to grow bear the best fruit. The journey is the reward. The man who is not disturbed by the hoots of the crowd can soon be the one leading it. The way of the sage is to act but not to compete, for a man to conquer himself is the first and noblest of all victories. The secret of happiness is to find a congenial monotony. If you want to be happy, be. The mind is everything. What you think you become. Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. The root of suffering is attachment. There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. However many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do you if you do not act upon them? To keep the body in good health is a duty. Otherwise, we shall not be able to keep our minds strong and clear. Even death is not to be feared by one who has lived wisely. No one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger. It is a man's own mind, not his enemy or foe, that lures him to evil ways. Your purpose in life is to find your purpose and give your whole heart and soul to it. The trouble is, you think you have time. In the end, only 3 things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you. Thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. What you are is what you have been. What you'll be is what you do now. There is nothing more dreadful than the habit of doubt. Doubt separates people. It is a poison that disintegrates friendships and breaks up pleasant relations. It is a thorn that irritates and hurts. It is a sword that kills. Every human being is the author of his own health or disease. We are shaped by our thoughts. We become what we think. When the mind is pure, joy follows like a shadow that never leaves. To enjoy good health, to bring true happiness to one's family, to bring peace to all, one must first discipline and control one's own mind. If a man can control his mind, he can find the way to enlightenment, and all wisdom and virtue will naturally come to him. Just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. The tongue, like a sharp knife, kills without drawing blood. Do not overrate what you have received, nor envy others. He who envies others does not obtain peace of mind. To live a pure, unselfish life, one must count nothing as one's own in the midst of abundance. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Whatever words we utter should be chosen with care, for people will hear them and be influenced by them for good or ill. It is better to travel well than to arrive. The foolish man seeks happiness in the distance. The wise grows it under his feet. If we could see the miracle of a single flower clearly, our whole life would change. An idea that is developed and put into action is more important than an idea that exists only as an idea. The secret of health for both mind and body is not to mourn for the past, not to worry about the future, or not to anticipate troubles, but to live in the present moment wisely and earnestly. There are only two mistakes one can make along the road to truth: not going all the way and not starting. Your work is to discover your work and then with all your heart to give yourself to it. The whole secret of existence is to have no fear. Never fear what will become of you. Depend on no one. Only the moment you reject all help are you freed. Meditate. Live purely. Be quiet. Do your work with mastery like the moon. Come out from behind the clouds, shine. Those who are free of resentful thoughts surely find peace. Wear your ego like a loose-fitting garment. The darkest night is ignorance. If you knew what I know about the power of giving, you would not let a single meal pass without sharing it in some way.